Christ-centered model for early Genesis, I'd like to say it isn't anti-evolution as much as it is procreation. The idea that, yes, God routinely used the earth, he worked with the earth and in the earth and in the seas to create living things is what the text says. But creation had to have help. Creation is like us. It is a fitting creation for creatures like us. It can't do God's will without God's help any more than we can. And that is sort of a recurring theme in Scripture, and it fits well with a creation like that, it can try to respond to God's word, but to really accomplish God's word, God's help is required. And so it isn't pure creation and it isn't pure evolution. Actually, it depends on where you look. The amount of God's direct intervention changes from one day to the other. For example, on the third day when he commands the earth to bring forth vegetation, it says the earth does it. The earth does it without him doing anything else. But that wasn't the case with the creatures of the seas and the creatures of the land. And so what happens each day varies a little bit, but I won't go into the details on that. But what I want to show today is that God's fingerprints are on the creation. If we look at the creation of life in the world, his fingerprints are on it. Nature couldn't do it without God's help. So even though I'm not denying evolution, I'm adding creation. I'm denying naturalism, basically, is what I'm denying. And the Cambrian Explosion is one of the places where this is more obvious. Now, nothing is so obvious that people determined to deny it can't deny it. Okay? There's nothing that obvious in this world. There's nothing so obviously true that if people want to not believe it, they cannot believe it. But the Cambrian Explosion is a giant problem for naturalism. Most naturalists, obviously, they're naturalists for a reason. So they would say, oh, no, that's not true. The Cambrian Explosion, whatever happened, God did it, or evolution did it. So they have an evolution of the gaps, you might say, that no matter what happened, no matter how much change took place and how little time, well, evolution must have done it because evolution is responsible for everything. It's a very tight circular reasoning. All there is nature. So if something happened, nature did it. There's no point in time at which they would question and say, well, wait a minute, our understanding of how this change occurs doesn't fit with how much change occurred in how little time. Nah, whatever happened, nature did it. It's a naturalism of the gaps. And, gap arguments, I think, are okay. They're okay in either direction when the conditions are met. In the case of a God of the gaps argument, and I've said it in another video, if we were present when Jesus changed the water into wine in his first public miracle, we might notice that he wasn't expecting to do that, but his mother made a surprise request, and so he decided to accede to the request. He told servants, not even his people, go get water and go put it in vessels. He didn't touch the water. He didn't touch the vessels. They weren't his. The people doing it weren't his. And yet he still changed the water into wine. So I would conclude that is a miracle. Now, scientifically, can you prove it's a miracle? No, you can't. All you can say with naturalism is, well, we have no good natural explanation for how that happened, but we'll keep trying. That's as far as you can go with science. So you cannot prove scientifically that the Cambrian Explosion was a miracle. It was God creating, as it describes in Genesis 1, on the fifth day, when he created the creatures of the ocean, laying out all the basic body plans that he would then use for then on. You can't prove that by science, but it is still a reasonable conclusion. It's just that science cannot address questions of divine action. That's all. Science is not the right tool to detect it. Couldn't see God if God were standing right in front of him. However, when you look at how naturalism says phyla are supposed to develop, basically you start with a species of creature, and then over time some population of that species gets so different that it becomes its own species. And then that species over time might split again, and both of them might split. So we have 4 species, and that might happen a couple more times. Then eventually, one of them gets so different from the original group that it would actually be a different genus. Not even the same genus. Before the species splitting were all in the same genus. One of them became different enough to where, you know what, we would classify that as its own genus. And then that proceeds for a time, and those 2 groups get more separate over time. And eventually, some member of that new genus gets so different from the original group that it could be considered a new family. And that then those family would start spitting out its own species and maybe form over a period of time another genus or 2 or 10. And you would wind up eventually getting your whole new suborder, and then an order, and a class. And eventually, over enough time, if there was enough change, they would be so different that they would form a new phyla. And that's the way the naturalistic explanation for how new phyla got here. So they say, you're looking at the tips of branches of 2 different branches. But if you trace it all back to the root, they had common ancestor. They came from the same tree. Well, that process takes a lot of time. But that's not what we see with the Cambrian Explosion. So I'm not trying to prove God did it with scientific evidence, because scientific evidence can't do that. But I'm going to show it's reasonable to believe that this is an anomaly. This is an anomaly. You can show that by science. And it's reasonable to believe that it's a case of we found God's fingerprints on creation. So, I will admit there is a long history of direct action, when nature doing stuff, and before we had the scientific method, we attributed it all to God's direct action. And over time, case after case, we've shown, nope, that's not true. That's nature operating according to laws. Now, who made the laws? Well, we would say God also made the laws. He isn't just the God of the gap. He's the God of the gap and everything outside it. But over time, we've shown these things that we thought were due to God's direct action, they were really the result of laws. So you say, well, Mark, look at the history, look at the track record. And I would answer, yeah, but that's what it should look like before we had the scientific method. Over time, we found one thing after another was really nature operating according to laws and not God's direct action. However, we have a case here, and where there is a problem known for a long time, and scientists have had a long time to look at it, and they've tried to solve the problem and find the natural explanation that resolves the paradox of how could this happen? How could nature do this? And the more they look, the more trouble they get into. At some point, it does make sense to go the other way and say, well, this is an anomaly. Maybe this is God's direct action. So if it's a problem you haven't looked at before, like when mankind first started developing the scientific method and started implementing it, if it's a problem that hasn't been studied before, we don't have a lot of knowledge about it, we didn't know it was a problem, really a God of the gaps argument is a terrible argument. You should only use a God of the gaps argument when you've looked at a problem for a long time, you recognize it's a problem for a long time, and the more you investigate it and try to solve it, the further you seem from finding a natural solution. All you find out is, wow, every theory or hypothesis we've put up to explain how nature did this has been shot down, and as we find more evidence, the problem looks bigger and bigger and not smaller and smaller. That's when a God of the gaps argument makes sense. And that's the case with the Cambrian Explosion. That's exactly what we have here. And that's why it's a good example of why God of the gaps arguments are not always wrong. And it's a good example of where we might find God's fingerprints of direct intervention in nature. Here's a quote from Charles Darwin. As to why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earliest periods before the Cambrian system, I can give no satisfactory answer. The case at present must remain inexplicable and may truly be urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained. So, that meets my criteria. Science has been aware of this problem for a very long time and has been trying to find a natural explanation for a very long time. One hypothesis was, well, these ancient creatures existed, but we just hadn't found their fossils yet. And that worked for a while, but eventually, if you've been looking for 150 years and you haven't found them, it's time to think maybe that's not the case. That's not the problem. Another hypothesis was, well, the ancestors were there, but conditions were not right to make fossils until the Cambrian. So maybe there was more calcium in the environment. Maybe there was more carbon in the environment. And they just had to build up a certain level, and then things started fossilizing. So those were some of the proposed natural explanations. But notice that they were explaining the lack of evidence to support the origin of phyla. It wasn't explaining, here's the evidence that we're right about how the phyla got here. They were explaining, maybe this is why we don't find the evidence that we expected to find, because naturalism would produce phyla over a long, long process, and we'd see all these splits in species slowly growing further apart and becoming more like the phyla that show up. But we don't see that. Well, they kept looking, as you should. You know, I favor, even though I say this looks like an instance where God has intervened, and it kind of matches the text. It matches my conception of what Genesis 1 is saying about God is calling the waters to bring forth living things, but then he's helping. And excuse me. That's what I see. So they've been looking 150, 200 years, and what they found in my mind is the worst possible outcome for naturalism. The worst possible outcome. It could hardly have been a bigger disaster than what they found. And they've spun this, the high-pitched whine you might hear when you investigate this question is them spinning it. But, excuse me, they did eventually find fossils in Precambrian layers. What does that do to the hypothesis that, well, the living things were there, but we couldn't find them because things don't fossilize until the Cambrian? It refutes that hypothesis. That hypothesis has been nullified. Fossils are hard to find, but things could fossilize before the Cambrian. We have fossils before the Cambrian. But the fossils they found were of what they call Vendian forms. Vendian forms. And most of scientists who are studying it are honest enough to admit that these Vendian forms are not good ancestors for what we see spring up in the Cambrian. And what we see spring up in the Cambrian appears with astonishing rapidity. And we could argue back and forth about how rapid and how short it was. But really, my studies have shown the more they look at it, the more astonishing the outcome is. The more shows up earlier and shows up more complex. It happens repeatedly with phyla after phyla. So, and I'm also prepared to show, like, there's 2 or 3 Vendian forms that they think, well, maybe this is a good ancestor for mollusks. Maybe this is a good ancestor for arthropods. Maybe this was a worm burrow. And I'm prepared to show in each of those cases, nope, that's not it. There are better explanations. There's no real reason to say what you're seeing here, for example, is a trace fossil of a worm burrow, except that scientists need there to be a worm there because such complex worms show up so early in the Cambrian. They need it to defend naturalism, but the evidence doesn't demand it. Same thing with Cambrella being the ancestor of any living mollusk. The evidence really is not there. Springia is not the first arthropod. It doesn't even really have bilateral symmetry. It has sort of a staggered or stair-step symmetry. But I don't want to get into the details. Basically, I'm looking at the big picture here. And the big picture is too much happened too fast. And the way it happened too fast, everything they found was the exact opposite of what the naturalistic expectation would expect them to find. So, the Cambrian wasn't stretched, the Cambrian Explosion wasn't stretched over the whole Cambrian period. It was compressed into just a fraction of it. Then they kept making finds like annelids. They thought annelids came along 230 million years later. Well, they recently found fossils of complex annelids very early on. And that's what happens with phyla after phyla. The complex things show up first. They'll find something 50 million years after the Cambrian, a simple version of some phyla, and they'll say, aha, this must be the ancestral form of the phyla, and it's sort of an ancestral form that survived relatively unchanged. And so the first members of the phyla must have looked like this. But then they keep digging, and what they find, in case after case, is that the original members of the phyla had more complexity, and the members they find 50 million years later lost complexity over time. Guys, you cannot get from bacteria to people by losing complexity. You can't. Nor should the evolution or the naturalistic expectation be that your forms start off complex. They start off with everything they might need, and then a few of them lose things that turns out they don't need in a particular niche over time. That is not what naturalism would predict. How do you start off complex under naturalistic assumptions? It doesn't work. So, after 150 years of being aware of the problem, and all of their looking only making the problem worse, I say a reasonable person with a true open mind, and not just utterly committed to the idea there's no supernatural, no matter how big the anomalies get. A reasonable person should be open to the idea that there is no natural explanation, and that's okay because there's a supernatural one, and it's one that is actually hinted at in the text of Genesis chapter 1 as outlined in my book. But really, this creation evolution thing is just really a tiny part of the book. Honestly, what is the book about? It's about something important. Not that. It's something important. How even the text of early Genesis points to the work and person of Christ. And obviously, that is evidence of a whole nother category. It is not scientific evidence, but if it can be shown that the text of early Genesis makes more sense when it points to the work and person of Christ, when you look at it like that, then obviously that couldn't be true unless Jesus really was the Messiah and the text really was divinely inspired. So it's not a scientific proof, but it is a proof. And it's what I do in the book, and it's laid out. And this conflict about creation versus evolution, I'm making this video, but it's not really the fight I want to fight. I want to soar beyond that conflict and direct men towards Jesus. Thank you so much for listening, and may God bless you.